Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have the second part of my May wrap-up. The fifth book that we read in May was The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. Cora Seaborn is a widow and a naturalist who ends up going from London to Essex. There is a storyline of a young surgeon, and there is also a storyline of a vicar who is fighting against his very religious villagers who are very superstitious of this Essex Serpent and believe it's the reason for animals dying and children going missing. And everyone was reading this book last year, and a lot of them all seem to really enjoy this, which is why I asked my mum to buy me this book for my birthday last year. I immediately started trying to read it then and couldn't get through the first 20 pages. I tried reading it again at Christmas, couldn't get through the first 20 pages. Tried it again earlier this year, couldn't get past the first 20 pages. And then I thought, well, I'm just going to have to do it because I really wanted to read all these books on my shelf. I wanted to see what all the hype was about, and having just read The Year of Reading Dangerously, I thought, let's go into this, let's read 50 pages, then another 50 pages, and we'll just do it slowly and make our way through it. There are parts of this book that I did enjoy. I understand what people are talking about with Sarah Perry using classic British storytelling skills. So like you have her writing in epistolary format at some point with these letters between different characters, and you have it following different characters at different points, and you have darker motives than you would ordinarily find. I'm hoping that Sarah Perry actually wrote the start of this book in the way she did, in this very dreary way, because that was how Cora was feeling while she was in London, and then when she moved to Essex, her storyline changed and everything was brighter and the storytelling was a lot better. I'm hoping was just because it was a way of the writing to represent what was going on in the character's life, and that is the only way I'm able to quantify the reasoning behind such a shift between London and Essex. There are definitely suggestions of the supernatural, even though there doesn't actually seem to be anything supernatural within the story itself. There seems to be a lot of reasoning. I enjoyed reading about this dark undertone of some marital abuse within the story because it is something that was swept under the carpet in these times, and I think that it was good to include it in a novel. A problem I found with this book was Sarah Perry had a lot to talk about, but I don't think she had a lot of time to discuss it, and I think you get this a lot with debut novels, especially if you read I'm talking from my own experience of my writing and all the debut novels I've read. You can often see topics that the writer wanted to talk about, but they don't go into great depths about them, so they include everything they want to write about in that one book, and then later on you find that they will have explored that idea a lot better in their later works than they could do in their first book. I am hoping that that is something Perry touches on again in her future works and discusses in greater depth, because I don't think it went as in-depth as it could have done here. It felt like everything was barely scratching the surface and that I was detached from a lot of the characters. I didn't really feel like I was ever fully invested in any of these characters' issues. Like, one character wants to become part of the suffragette movement, and there's this other character who's suffering some sort of possible mental illness that could be related to a physical illness. There is a son who is maybe autistic, who is very fond of collecting things, and the vicar has a very large family and there's happiness, but he's worried about keeping his family happy. And then you have the surgeon who's really trying to improve surgery in Britain, but obviously he's being held back by his elder peers. And there is a lot within this book, but there isn't enough time in the book to touch on every single subject, and I understand that. But I wish some of it had been taken out, more focus has been put onto some of the different aspects within this novel, because it's not like the book isn't enjoyable, it's just trying too much. It's trying to do too much in a short space of time. Obviously, other people really enjoy this book. Jessie Burton herself blurbed this book, John Burnside blurbed this book, and they know what they're talking about, so maybe it's just me. I will be keeping this book. I will be rereading this book. I think that this is a brilliant book would be a brilliant book to be reading at winter. It would make a great television adaptation at Christmas time for all the family to sit down and watch together on those cold winter nights. But I think that it tried to do too much, but Perry does know what she's talking about and clearly did a lot of historical research for this novel, and I commend her work here. She's won awards for this book. It wasn't the best book. It wasn't the best book It was definitely a solid debut novel, and I respect Perry for writing it, and I think that she is a great writer with a strong future ahead of her, really. Next, I read a book that I've already given away. I don't have it here to show you, and that is A Year of Marvellous Ways by Sarah Winman. I really struggled reading this book. The writing seemed to be all over the place. It begins with the character of Marvellous Ways, a character who believes that she has been living for a very long time, that her mother was a mermaid, and she lives by this river, and she's something like a bit of the wise woman that people in this town used to come to, but there is really nothing left of this town anymore, and she's on her own by this river. Then in comes a man who fought in the war, and he goes to visit a former girlfriend, a former friend. I think they were in... Either way, he knew her before he went into the war, and he comes back to see her, and they have this one wild night together, and they sleep together, and then in the morning she seemingly drowns herself. He ends up back with Marvellous Ways, and she is helping him with his recuperation, and both of them are telling their stories to one another to really begin to heal. That would have been a great story. However, the writing was really weird. In this book, Sarah Winman doesn't use any quotation marks, which is fine, but there didn't really seem to be any other reason behind it other than she thought that it looked cool. She used speech marks in When God Was a Rabbit, so I can't really understand her reasoning behind not using them here, because it didn't add anything to the story. In fact, it detracted from it because you were constantly having to tell who was speaking. There was this sense of some sort of magical realism here, but I didn't understand the need for it. The writing felt very much unpolished and unedited, and I read this book because everyone's been talking about her new book coming out in July, and I wanted to have read this book before I read that because everyone's reading that, so I thought, well, I'll finally read this. When Joanna Cannon sent out a call for books for reading for the well-being, I put it in a box and I sent it there alongside some other books because I didn't enjoy it myself, but I think that there are other people who would get a lot more out of the book than I did. Next, I read A Portable Shelter by Kirsty Logan. This book was very popular on BookTube, YouTube a few years ago. So, everyone was talking about The Gracekeepers when that came out. My friend Lily recommended it to me and I did purchase it. However, I still haven't read that book. But because I was trying to get through all these books on my shelves and I was feeling a bit left in some sort of reading slump after reading A Year of Marvellous Ways, I thought I'd read a short story collection. These are short stories that really seem to be surrounding Scottish folklore and folk tales, but they are told from the perspective of two women who are having a baby, and each night one of them tells the baby, the fetus, a different story. And the stories do seem to have links to each other in different ways. I wasn't sure why the stories had to be around the idea of these two characters relating the stories to the fetus, because the stories worked perfectly well on their own as a series of interlinked stories. I suppose it was to give you an idea of who these characters were talking to, but to me they really didn't serve much purpose. And maybe that's just because I wasn't reading enough into it. But yes, these are definitely great stories. I'm just not sure about the reasoning behind the inclusion of the parents.